All right. Let's dive into 1968, a really pivotal year in American history. We're going to explore the final year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. It was a time of intense pressure, personal struggles, and kind of a change, a shift in the whole fight for civil rights. And we're going to be using excerpts from the Rest is History podcast episode that focuses on the events of 1968 to kind of see what made this year so crucial.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? We always think of 1968 as this big turning point, but the ground had already been shifting under King's feet for a couple years before that. But 68, he was really facing challenges, unlike anything he'd ever dealt with before.
Yeah, that's a great point. It wasn't just, the fight for civil rights. The whole landscape was changing all around him. Just a few years before that, he was really, really at the peak of his influence. And then by 1966, his popularity starts to go down.
Yeah, and one of the big reasons for that was King's decision to shift focus. He moved from, Southern segregation to this much deeper problem of racial and economic inequality in the North. He realized that the fight wasn't just about overt discrimination, but it was about the whole system, the system that was keeping Black Americans from achieving real equality.
So it was less about laws and more about changing minds, changing the whole fabric of society.
Exactly. Exactly. And Teen Chicago campaign in the summer of 1966, I mean, it really exposed how difficult this new fight was going to be. You see, segregation in the South, that was all laid out in those Jim Crow laws, but the North, that was different. Discrimination was everywhere, in housing, jobs, even just everyday interactions, but it wasn't something you could easily fix with just laws.
Yeah, it must have been, so frustrating to finally break down all those legal barriers in the South just to run into a whole new set of obstacles in the North. Well, what were some of those specific obstacles?
Well, think about it. Like landlords making these informal agreements to keep Black families out, or businesses, quietly making sure Black people didn't get hired. These weren't things you could just pass a law against. They were ingrained in how those northern cities worked.
It's like fighting an invisible enemy almost.
Exactly. Exactly.
So tackling these invisible barriers, that required a totally different approach. You needed to really understand how deeply rooted this racial and economic injustice was.
Yeah.
And then to make things even worse, the political climate starts to shift too.
Oh, absolutely. In the 1966 midterm elections, the Republicans, they gained a lot of support. And a big part of that was this law and order rhetoric they were using. And that language, while it might have sounded like it was about everyone, it often had this hidden message. It appealed to people's anxieties about crime and unrest, and it often had these very clear racial undertones.
Yeah, it's like that dog whistle politics. It's unfortunately something we still see today.
Yeah, sadly, you're right. And so you have this shift in American politics to the right, and at the same time, King and the civil rights movement are starting to get more and more scrutiny from the media. Outlets that had been supportive before, they were now questioning if the movement was even relevant anymore, if it was actually making a difference.
So you have King facing all this pressure. You have the establishment, the media, and even some people within the movement itself.
Exactly, exactly. A new generation of activists, people like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, they were advocating for something called Black Power, and they saw King's nonviolent approach as too willing to compromise with a system that was still oppressing them.
I can see why they might feel that way after all those years of peaceful protests and still not seeing much progress on these really deeply rooted problems.
Yeah.
It makes sense that some people would think, well, maybe we need to try something more radical.
It's natural for a movement to evolve. As things change, the strategies and goals have to change too. Black Power, it really represented that shift. It emphasized Black self-reliance, racial pride, and a willingness to fight back against the status quo in a more aggressive way.
Yeah, and then, as if all this wasn't enough, you have the Vietnam War looming over everything.
Yeah, the Vietnam War was just tearing the country apart. And when King started speaking out against it in 1967, it caused a lot of problems for him. President Johnson turned against him, and a lot of the liberal establishment did too. King, you see, he saw that war as morally wrong, a waste of resources that could be used to fight poverty and inequality right here at home.
That speech he gave at Riverside Church in New York, that was incredibly powerful. He drew this really clear connection between the war in Vietnam and the fight for social justice in America. He compared the violence that was being done to Vietnamese civilians to the oppression that Black Americans were facing.
It was a very bold statement, And it really put him in the crosshairs. People called him a communist, a traitor. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, stepped up their surveillance on him and used his opposition to the war as an excuse to harass him.
Wow, so King's really in a tough spot. Some people think he's not radical enough, and others think he's a dangerous radical. He's being squeezed from both sides. So what does he do? How does he respond to all this pressure?
Well, instead of backing down, he actually doubles down. He launches the Poor People's Campaign, and it's this really ambitious plan to confront the nation with the reality of poverty and demand economic justice.
And that's where the idea of Resurrection City comes in, right? This shanty town he wanted to set up right in the heart of Washington, D.C.,
Right.
bringing all these impoverished Americans together from all walks of life to demand change.
Exactly. He wanted to create this visual representation of the struggle so many Americans were facing, regardless of their race or background. But this plan, it met with a lot of resistance, not just from the people in power, but also from some of King's own allies. They were worried it would be too radical, you know. They thought it could hurt the movement's image.
So even within the movement, there's this tension, this debate about whether King's commitment to nonviolence was the right approach or if they needed to be more confrontational.
Absolutely.
And then, right in the middle of all this, the political attacks, the disagreements within the movement, the growing pressure, King gets this call about a sanitation worker strike in Memphis, Tennessee.
And this event, it might have seemed separate from the larger civil rights movement, but it actually became a crucial moment in King's final year. This wasn't about voting rights or desegregation. This was about workers' rights, about the dignity of people who did jobs that everyone needed, but that most people just ignored.
It's almost symbolic, isn't it? A fight for basic dignity, for the right to make a decent living and be treated like a human being. It's really at the core of everything King was fighting for, right?
Absolutely. And that's why, even with all the pressure he was facing, even with some of his closest advisors telling him to stay away, King felt like he had to get involved. He saw the sanitation worker struggle as this small-scale version of the larger fight for economic justice.
So he goes to Memphis, gives that incredibly powerful speech at Mason Temple, and promises to come back and lead a march in support of those sanitation workers.
He did.
But that march, is supposed to be peaceful. It ends up in chaos. And what's really striking is it wasn't the police who started the violence that time.
Right.
It was violence from within the march itself, wasn't it? I remember reading about young people. Some of them get caught up in that black power idea. They clashed with the police. They started looting.
Exactly. They didn't believe in cooperating with the authorities at all. They saw it as a betrayal, and the whole situation just spiraled out of control. For King, who had built his entire philosophy on nonviolence, this was just devastating. It really shook his faith in his own methods. And the media, they jumped on it, portraying him as a leader who was losing control of his movement.
It must have been just this crushing moment of disillusionment for him. And then he goes back to Atlanta, questioning everything, trying to understand what went wrong in Memphis. So what happens next?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in part 2. We'll look at how King dealt with this setback, his decision to go back to Memphis, and the events that ultimately led to his tragic assassination.
Wow. I'm already completely hooked. This is a really fascinating look at this critical time in American history.
Yeah, definitely stick with us. The story just gets even more complex and compelling in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Martin Luther King Jr.'s final year. Last time, we left off with King really grappling with the aftermath of that chaotic march in Memphis, that setback that really shook his belief in nonviolence.
Yeah, I can't even imagine how heavy that must felt for him. This was a man whose whole philosophy was about peaceful resistance, and then suddenly he's faced with this violence coming from within his own movement.
It was a real crisis of faith, and in the middle of all this turmoil, King's at a crossroads. He could just walked away from the Memphis campaign. I mean, he could have said the violence was reason enough to pull out, but that wasn't how King operated.
Right. It feels like if he'd just walked away, it would have gone against everything he stood for. His dedication to justice, his belief in never giving up, his responsibility to all the people who believed in him. Exactly. And so even with all that personal turmoil, even with some people telling him to just drop it, King felt like he had to go back to Memphis. It was like this moral obligation. He couldn't turn his back on those sanitation workers, those people who were putting everything on the line for basic dignity and respect.
It's incredible that he went back to Memphis with all that uncertainty hanging over him.
Yeah.
It would have been so easy to just give in to fear and doubt.
Yeah.
But he chose to face it head on.
That's what made King such a powerful leader, you know? He didn't shy away from tough situations, even when his own ideas and strategies were being challenged. He saw that sanitation strike as a crucial fight in this bigger battle for economic justice,
Hmm.
a fight that went beyond just racial equality.
Yeah, he was connecting race and class. He was recognizing that true equality meant tackling both the racism that kept Black Americans from having basic rights and the economic systems that trapped them in poverty.
Exactly, exactly. And this idea that race and class were connected, it was at the heart of the Poor People's Campaign, and King was still planning to launch it just weeks after everything that happened in Memphis. Before he went back to Memphis, he gave his last Sunday sermon in Washington, D.C., and in that sermon, he doubled down on his commitment to the campaign, and he denounced the Vietnam War again.
Wow, that's a powerful message. He was refusing to be silenced, refusing to be intimidated by the people trying to undermine him. He was really embracing his role as this prophetic voice, even if it meant alienating the powerful and putting himself in danger.
And that sense of purpose, that unwavering commitment to what he believed in, it really shows in his actions during his last few days. Think about it. Death threats, a bomb scare, all this tension in Memphis, and King still chose to stay at the Lorraine Motel, a place that symbolized his solidarity with the Black community.
Yeah, that was a deliberate act of courage, wasn't it? He could have chosen a safer place. But staying at the Lorraine, that was a statement in itself.
It was. And then on the evening of April 3rd, in the middle of a huge thunderstorm, King gave his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech at Mason Temple. Listening to it now, knowing what was going to happen, it's chilling. You can hear this sense of foreboding, this acknowledgement of his own mortality, but also this unwavering belief that justice will prevail.
Yeah, it's almost like he had a premonition about his own death, and yet he was still so resolute, so committed to the cause. He was urging his followers to persevere no matter what.
There's this haunting beauty in that speech. It's hope and resignation all mixed together. It's acknowledging how long and hard the road is, but never giving up on the power of love and nonviolence to overcome hate and oppression.
And then, less than 24 hours later, he's assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. His life cut short by this senseless act of violence. It's a moment that's burned into America's memory, a reminder of how fragile progress can be and how powerful hatred still is.
King's assassination was a shockwave that went through the whole country. It triggered this outpouring of grief and rage. Riots erupted in cities everywhere. It was a sign of just how raw and powerful the emotions were, and it showed how deep the racial divides in the country still were.
It's heartbreaking that the man who devoted his life to preaching nonviolence would end up a victim of such horrific violence.
Yeah, it is a cruel irony, but it also shows just how powerful King's message was, you know?
Mm.
How much he challenged the status quo, how much he threatened the people who benefited from those systems of oppression.
Right. And after King was assassinated, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, they launched this massive manhunt for his killer. It's almost unbelievable to think of Hoover, who spent years surveilling and trying to discredit King, now leading the effort to find his murderer.
It's a complicated situation. It's important to remember what the political climate was like back then. Hoover had to look tough on crime, especially in a case this big. He couldn't afford to look weak or uncaring, especially with all the racial tensions going on.
So it was more about protecting the FBI's image than it was about getting justice for King.
It was a bit of both, really. Hoover wanted to prove the FBI was effective. He wanted to assert his own power, and maybe, just maybe, he wanted to deflect some of the criticism that the FBI had been getting for how they treated King.
And in the end, they did capture James Earl Ray, right?
Right.
A career criminal with a history of racist views.
Yes. After a 2-month manhunt that spanned the globe, they finally caught Ray at Heathrow Airport in London. He was trying to escape to Rhodesia, a white-ruled country in Africa. His capture, it brought some closure, but it also brought up even more questions.
Like what?
Well, Ray confessed to the crime, but then he took back his confession. And then all these conspiracy theories started popping up. Theories fueled by the political atmosphere at the time, the FBI's secret operations, and this lingering feeling that Ray might not have acted alone.
So even though they caught the man who pulled the trigger, there were still these doubts, these unanswered questions about who might have been behind it all.
Exactly. And those questions are still around today, adding this extra layer of complexity to the whole story of King's assassination. But what can't be denied is that his death had this huge, lasting impact, not just on the civil rights movement, but on the whole country.
It feels like a turning point in American history. Like there's a before and an after King's assassination that changed the course of the fight for social justice.
Absolutely. King's death showed how deep the racial divisions in the country were, even after all the legal victories of the civil rights movement. Those riots that broke out after he was killed, they weren't just about mourning, they were an explosion of all that rage and frustration that had been building for years.
Like all that hope that King represented, it was shattered by that one bullet.
Yeah.
And within the movement itself, there must have been this sense of loss, this uncertainty about how to move forward without their most important leader.
King's death left a huge hole that was almost impossible to fill. His charisma, his moral authority, his strategic thinking, and his commitment to nonviolence, it all made him unique. And with him gone, the movement had to figure out how to adapt, how to keep fighting for the things King had been focusing on in those last few years, poverty and inequality.
What happened to the Poor People's Campaign? The one he was going to start in Washington just a few weeks after he died.
It did go ahead. But without King leading it, it didn't have the same focus or energy. Resurrection City, that encampment that was meant to be this powerful symbol of poverty, it ran into logistical problems, there were internal conflicts, and in the end, it didn't really achieve its goals.
It's almost like the campaign itself became another victim of King's assassination.
In a way, it did. And his death really cast a shadow over the entire country. The sense of despair and disillusionment, that just got worse as the Vietnam War dragged on, political divisions deepened, and the dream of a just and equal society seemed further away than ever.
So 1968 really was a turning point, wasn't it? It started with all this hope and possibility, but ended in tragedy and turmoil.
It was. 1968 shattered a lot of illusions. It exposed the cracks in American society. And it set the stage for a whole decade of social and political upheaval that would reshape the country in really profound ways.
This has been a really enlightening journey so far, unpacking the complexities of King's last year and the events that led to his assassination.
It has.
And now I'm really curious to hear more about what you were talking about before, this idea of King's enduring legacy.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because in our final part, we're going to shift gears a bit. We're going to explore how King's message of hope and justice is still relevant today, even though the struggle for equality is far from over. Stick with us as we delve deeper into the man, the myth, and the lasting power of his dream.
So we spent the last couple parts really going deep into 1968, tracing all the events that led up to Dr. King's assassination and kind of trying to understand the immediate aftermath of that. But, you mentioned this idea of his enduring legacy. And I'm curious about that. It almost seems like contradictory, doesn't it? I mean, here's this man who preached nonviolence, and then he's silenced by this brutal act.
It is a paradox, yeah. But it kind of shows you how powerful his message really was. It wasn't just about him being there, It lived on, and it still resonates with us. You're right after King died, there was so much grief and despair. Some people were just angry. And those riots that broke out all over the country, that wasn't just people mourning. That was years of frustration boiling over.
Yeah, it was like that hope that he represented. It was just snuffed out in an instant.
Yeah.
Did people back then believe that the movement could even survive without him?
Honestly, there was a lot of uncertainty. King wasn't just a leader. He was what held everyone together. He was like the moral compass. But what happened after that, after all that darkness, it was really something. New leaders came forward, organizations changed their approach, and the fight for justice, it went on. They were inspired by King, but they also had to adapt to the changing times,
So it wasn't about trying to be exactly like King, but more about keeping his spirit alive in new ways.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, King wasn't, some perfect being. He was human. He had his flaws, his contradictions. And realizing that, I think it actually makes what he accomplished even more impressive. He wasn't preaching from some pedestal, He was dealing with the same prejudices, the same doubts, the same fears that we all deal with.
Yeah, I think that makes his message much more powerful, actually. That even while he was struggling himself, he never gave up on the idea of a better future. He stayed committed to love and justice. It makes it more relatable, more human. But how do we balance that human side of King with the almost mythical figure he's become, this icon of social change?
That's the challenge, isn't it? But it's a challenge we have to take on. We can't simplify his story, turn him into some two-dimensional saint. If we want to really understand what King left behind, we have to see both sides, the man and the myth, the victories and the defeats. That's the only way to truly appreciate all that he did.
So when we talk about King's legacy today, what are the most important things to keep in mind besides, the fight for racial equality?
Well, his commitment to nonviolence, that's still incredibly important, don't you think? In a world where violence is like the default answer to almost every conflict, King's message offers a different way. It challenges us to think about how we can break those cycles of aggression and revenge.
Right. But it's not just about being passive, right? It's about actively working to create a more just world, facing our own prejudices, holding people in power accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And that's another crucial part of King's legacy. He understood that individual actions aren't enough. We have to tackle the systems that create injustice,
Mhm.
the economic gaps, the political structures that perpetuate inequality. His work later on, like the Poor People's Campaign, it really showed this shift towards addressing those systemic problems.
Which is something we're still struggling with now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mass incarceration, the wealth gap, the attack on voting rights. It's like we're fighting the same battles King was fighting all those years ago.
It's true. It's a reminder that the fight for justice never really ends. But King's legacy gives us hope. It shows that progress is possible, that even small acts of courage and compassion can make a difference. It's not about reaching some perfect world overnight, but about constantly pushing for a more just and fair society.
It's about the journey, not just the destination, right? And King's message, it's a powerful inspiration for that journey. It reminds us to never lose sight of that dream, that vision of a world where everyone has a chance to reach their full potential.
And that, I think, is what makes his legacy so enduring. This unwavering belief that we can create a future based on justice, love, and nonviolence. It's a message that goes beyond time and place. It challenges every one of us to do what we can to make that dream a reality.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. We've learned so much, not just about the events of King's last year, but about the lasting impact of his work. His legacy shows us that one person can inspire millions, can change the course of history, and leave a mark that continues to shape our world today.
Thank you for being with us on this journey. We hope you've gained a renewed sense of purpose and that you'll continue to carry the torch of justice and equality in your own life.